Hello, everybody. Welcome to Danger on Delmarva. My name is Rhonda Jefferson, and I'll be your host as we explore the dark and winding roads that lead around the Delmarva Peninsula. So once again, I'm coming back to add something. I found that when listening to the recording back, my voice sounded more scratchy than I even thought it could sound. In some places it's not as bad, but I apologize. There's a pollen warning for the day after I'm recording this, so it's probably the onset of allergies at this point in the year. So if you're from the area, you probably have seen the cars that are covered in green every year around this time. So I apologize for how it sounds especially near the beginning of the episode. Thank you. If you're new here, welcome. And if you're a returning listener, welcome back. If you're not familiar with Delmarva, we are an area in the mid-Atlantic region of the United States that encompasses all of Delaware, Maryland to the east of the Chesapeake Bay Bridge, and Virginia to the northeast of the Chesapeake Bay Bridge Tunnel. I hope everybody is having a great day so far, and we are going to be going back to Virginia today, specifically to Tangier Island. Now, this is going to be the third part in a series about the Pitts family. I had originally was just going to do this story, but found another one connected to his brother from a few years earlier. Now, the Pitts family, their father was a judge, and many of the family actually were judges or lawyers, attorneys, and one was even a senator from Maryland. So the family did have influence, and just some of the events that took place around them were very interesting. We did hear that the father, Judge E.P. Pitts, stood against the Confederacy and even led to the impeachment proceedings beginning for him. But based on other information, it seems as though he was able to keep his position, even with a record of a letter that was written by one person to Abraham Lincoln and then a response mentioning Judge Pitts and that he wanted to do good. So the family, again, they did have influence, but there was that period of time where the father of the family was not in the good graces of the government, but the tide turned rather quickly, and by the next decade, everybody loved Judge Pitts again. So the tide can turn on how some people may perceive another person. And today's story will be about James Pitts, and we began this story on the last episode, and we're going to be picking up about at the same spot. Now, as I anticipate the episode itself being longer again, I am going to just briefly go through the things I normally go through at the beginning of an episode. All of my sources will be in the description of the episode. If it was reviewed or obtained from a pay site, I will still include the link just in case someone may have a subscription, but I do want to make you aware that some of them are, again, a pay site. Also, I think I'm figuring out what one of the issues is with Google. Well, it's not Google Podcasts anymore, it's YouTube Music. So with this episode, I'm going to try to approach it a little differently and see if the episode comes up the way it's supposed to, where I can share the direct link. Also, if you would like to support the podcast in terms of cost for research, like the pay sites that I may use or the platform hosting for the podcast, I will have links to a PayPal or Buy Me a Coffee, and that may help me explore different avenues and have more access to different research and that type of thing. And lastly, my disclaimer that almost every episode and case that I cover will include some discussion of topics that may be kind of hard to listen to. And these topics may include violence, murder, tragedies along the scale of a natural disaster or man-made disaster. So again, I just want everybody to be aware. And with that, let's get into the second part of James Pitts' story and the murder of Dr. Thomas Walter. So last week we ended before a topic where I was thinking about different motives or why he might have done what he did. Just to give a very brief recap, Dr. Walter had lived on Tangier Island but became ill and had to move to a different part of the state for a period of time. Dr. Pitts moved into the area and as well, and he kind of took over Dr. Walter's patients while Dr. Walter was out of the area. Now, a lot of people did prefer Dr. Walter, and so when he came back, I think that Dr. Pitts saw that a lot of patients would be going back to him, and so as not to undercut each other for prices, they had agreed to meet at some point and go over a fee schedule. So it was really looking at, one doctor didn't want the other one to be charging half the cost because that would, in some ways, be stealing patients from each other. Also, upon Dr. Walter's return to the island, Dr. Pitts asked to borrow $5, in which Dr. Walter's widow reported that was not an unusual thing to happen, and they had loaned him money before and never had any issues in getting it back or any arguments. But on the occasion of Dr. Pitts and Dr. Walter meeting to go over the fee schedule, there was some type of altercation with Dr. Pitts shooting Dr. Walter 4 times. Dr. Pitts claimed self-defense, but some of his descriptions in what occurred were not very consistent at all. So here's where a thought of mine does come in, and that's where Dr. Pitts was hospitalized for a period of time, actually just briefly before all of this happened, where he had spent a month in a hospital in Baltimore for an addiction to what was called morphia and whiskey. So in modern terms, we would say that he was struggling with substance abuse issues. He also, in fact, had only returned to Tangier Island about 6 weeks prior to when this happened. So I kind of feel bad for the patients or residents of Tangier Island because there seems to have been some overlap there where both doctors would have been, off the island and unavailable. So as the Baltimore Sun quoted, they said, "It is thought by some that his mind was affected by the use of drugs and stimulants, and that the killing may have been done in a moment of frenzy, resulting from the effect of professional jealousy on a disordered brain. The parties to the tragedy are each about 25 years of age." End quote. So speculation as to truly what had happened was divided amongst the people that lived on Tangier Island or those in other parts of the state that may have known one or both of the men. Even though those on the island tended to lean towards Dr. Walter being a victim, not being the aggressor, but there were also friends of Dr. Pitts who said there was no way that this could have happened, that he would not have murdered someone in cold blood. So just based on some facts that we know, Dr. Walter was shot 4 times. One entered the back, and based on the other gunshots, I had my own theories about the order they took place in. But the last one was a bullet that went through Dr. Walter's back. So he was retreating, but he was still shot in the back by someone that he had used to be cordial with. Pitts's own landlady was prepared to testify against him because she was there and had witnessed at least part of what went on, as she was not in the room with Pitts and Walter when Walter was first shot. But this is kind of telling to me because I'm sure she would have liked to have him as a tenant to stay longer in terms of income. So the fact that she was testifying against someone that may actually cause her to lose money, to me, says that she was telling the truth to the best of her knowledge, again, not being in the room when the incident took place. Also, she said that she heard Dr. Pitts say that he would have finished the job if Dr. Walter had still been alive after those 4 gunshots that hit him. And as we heard in Major Sidney Pitts's case, that was the other brother that I did an episode on, people did come forward after the fact about hearing things that Pitts may have said prior to the events. Some people actually stated that even up to 2 weeks before the killing took place, that Pitts had made statements about killing, quote, him, which would mean Walter. As many people were, for lack of a better word, against Dr. Pitts, Pitts's attorneys did file for a change of venue, which was approved. So the trial would take place in Hampton, Virginia. So as a way to counter this, some of Dr. Pitts's friends got together and wrote a letter that was given to the Baltimore Sun to be printed. Now, I know Baltimore is not on the Eastern Shore, but it was one of the biggest publications, so that would get the word out more efficiently, I guess you would say, than some of the smaller newspapers in the area. Plus, it would give it more widespread attention, which I don't know if that would have been good or bad. I'm going to read what the Baltimore Sun wrote about the letter, with some parts of the letter mixed into it. But again, just to reiterate, it is from the Baltimore Sun. To begin the excerpt, the friends of Dr. Pitts, the prisoner, claim it will appear that he acted in self-defense upon such provocation as would have impelled any gentleman to a similar act in protecting his person from humiliation and probable injury at the hands of one so greatly his physical superior as was Dr. Walter, the deceased. They say that all statements showing deliberation or premeditation on the part of Dr. Pitts are without exception mere fabrications, and that the fatal shot was fired in a personal encounter between the 2 gentlemen, in which before he was shot, Dr. Walter inflicted a severe blow upon Dr. Pitts, the trace of which the latter still plainly bears. No man in the community has a higher reputation than Dr. Pitts for kindness of heart and amiability. He was a favorite among his associates and with the professors of the University of Maryland, and was graduated in fine standing some few years since from that institution. For a year or more, he has been addicted to the excessive use of morphine, but since receiving treatment about 2 months ago, he has abstained entirely from the habit, and his mind has been restored to a normal condition. The horrible details of the tragedy, as first reported, suggested to his friends that the theory of insanity from the cause above indicated. More accurate information, both as to his mental condition and the facts of the killing, have satisfied them that he was not only in full possession of his faculties, but that he was justified in the act. And here ends the quote from the Baltimore Sun. I do want to point out one part that struck me here, as there was a portion that insinuated that Dr. Walter was physically superior to Dr. Pitts. However, there, were people that said that, Dr. Walter was not really totally up to par yet, that he was still feeling the results of the illness that, had caused him to have to move away from the island for a while. So I tend to believe that Dr. Walter was not, a huge man or an intimidating man. But based on the descriptions, it was Pitts who would have been, more able to defend himself without the use of the gun, that Pitts would have been in a more healthy state in order to cause an injury to another person. So while the inquest had been held and it was determined that Walter died of pistol wounds, James Pitts was held for for his indictment. At this point, everybody knew that his defense to the killing would be self-defense, but more people were coming forward with testimony or statements that Dr. Pitts had been planning this. On May 16th, which was one day before the shooting, it was said that he had been trying to trade his pistol for something else, another gun, but eventually he bought some Smith & Wesson cartridges. People also pointed to the fact that he had seemed very calm on the day that the murder took place, or killing, I should say, and that even after the killing, he just calmly walked into a local business to turn himself in for what he had just done. So a lot of people thought he was too calm, and maybe it was because he was actually calculated in planning this killing. I do admit, sitting here in 2024, my first thought was he could have at least tried CPR until I remembered that we were looking at a case from the late 19th century or 1800s. And I did want to do a little bit of researching on at least finding a date for CPR, and it's a little more difficult than I thought to kind of firm down a date, because in the 19th century, I found there was actually kind of a form of CPR where arms would be raised up over the head and to bring air in and then down to exhale, and the person had to be laying on their back. But it really was nowhere even remotely close to what we think of today. So there's really no way that at that point that anybody could help Dr. Walter no matter what, given the time period and just the lack of even medical equipment and knowledge at the time. Just kind of my thoughts too in the description of how he acted after the shooting. And this is going on the records, at least that we have at this point, not being able to view every piece of documentation that was around at the time of the murder, or killing, I should say, as he's not gone to trial yet. But it was the fact that he actually walked into, a business, a store, and said that he had just killed Dr. Walter. In those moments, he didn't act in a way that many people would have acted. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't upset. He wasn't, kind of flustered at all. So that really stuck out, especially to the people of the community. And based on comments, it sounded like even, before Dr. Walter came back, everybody had already preferred Dr. Walter. So I do also just want to think a little bit, at least, of the other side of the coin, trying to bring myself back to objectivity, in the matter. People who really loved Dr. Walter as a doctor may have been more prone to either misinterpret things they might have seen, or looking back at events or conversation that happened weeks ago, they might look back at it and think about the last time they spoke with Dr. Pitts, or what he acted like even before he left to go to the hospital in Baltimore. Could any of those things be influencing the way that the townspeople were looking at the killing? And I think that's important to look at in every case, whether it's current or what's called vintage, is that it can be very difficult to maintain the objectivity when reviewing statements and the evidence. And I had to tell myself that because at least while initially reading through everything, I wanted to maintain my objectivity. Now, what happened after I read all the newspaper reports and things that happened afterwards, things like that, Yes, I drew my own opinion, but, I wanted to try to stay objective at least up until I had reviewed everything and had a chance to form my own opinion. I do just want to briefly go back to when Dr. Pitts entered the business where he was to be arrested, and initially made a statement that he had killed Dr. Walter, and that his reaction to, some of the patrons or other people that came in was kind of similar to me as his brother, Sidney, or Major Sidney Pitts. And that was the first episode I did about the brothers. But Sidney, he was an attorney, or studied to be an attorney himself, and he was looking at things kind of analytically and wouldn't recognize the authority of some of the people who tried to arrest him. And if you haven't listened to that episode, I'm not going to say too much more. But coming forward now to this incident, Dr. James Pitts, in some ways, acted like his brother. Some people tried to make a citizen's arrest. They wanted to make sure that he was detained, but he refused to cooperate until law enforcement got there. Now, a citizen's arrest can be made, so if one would think almost that if he walked into a place, said he had just killed somebody, that one would expect that, if capable of detaining him, some of the people may want to do so to protect the others that are out in the community. And again, this is the 1800s. It's not like somebody could have gone to the back and picked up a phone and said, hey, we have him here. It had to be approached a little bit differently. And as soon, though, as a law enforcement officer who was the constable, Constable Connerton, came into the store, Pitts recognized that authority and was peacefully arrested. So to some that had observed this, and though I didn't see anything explicitly saying this, it sounded like some people had started to gather and try to see everything that was going on. So people observing this formed an opinion that he might have been cold-hearted or callous. Some even said there really wasn't a surprise that he had done something like that. Now, moving forward to his trial, just a note from the previous paragraph or comment I made earlier about one of his uncles being a senator for Maryland. Well, Senator Dennis was an attorney first, so even though he was from Maryland, he had practiced law in Virginia before, and he also came to help represent his nephew in this again. The first day of the trial was September 10th, 1884, and a lot of the first day was taken up by some of the administrative things that needed to be done. There was also making sure that they found a good jury pool. Remember, the venue had been changed to Hampton, Virginia, instead of being in Tangier or very close to where the men lived. The distance itself is only about 12 miles, but that is all water. So getting across those 12 miles still takes a little bit of time today, but back then would have taken a lot longer. So even though it was pretty close in proximity as far as the people that knew each other, or the risk of having a contaminated jury pool was less by going to Hampton as compared to trying to try it on the eastern shore of Virginia, as more people would have known one or both of the doctors involved in this instance. At 4:30 p.m., they were prepared to call the first witness. And yes, they called the first witness at 4:30. I thought that was kind of late, but I guess if people did have to travel, the courts may have been trying to at least get a couple of witnesses in so that more people wouldn't have to come back again the next day and wait to be called. I don't know. It just seemed pretty late to call a witness, especially the first witness of the trial. The first person called was the son of Dr. Pitts's landlady. Now, his first name was not given, just an abbreviation of JNO, so I don't know if that was short for Jonathan, but we'll just call him Mr. Thomas. And just so there's no confusion, Dr. Walter went by his middle name, which was Thomas as well, so I just wanted to make that clarification. So Mr. Thomas said that he had seen Dr. Pitts call for Dr. Walter, and Walter, as per some of the other information we had heard about, he said he had to go, that he wasn't available at that time, but would come back. But Dr. Pitts was insistent and told Dr. Walter to come in now, according to Mr. Thomas. He did say, though, that Mr. Thomas, did have to leave at some point and went and got some water, and he didn't get back until the actual killing had taken place. So he only had information about what had drawn Dr. Walter into the home. When he came back from fetching water, he saw Dr. Walter on the ground and was, in his words, nearly dead. Now, as previous information has shown, Dr. Pitts did check for a pulse, so I don't know if by nearly dead it was Mr. Thomas, hoping that they could somehow help Dr. Walter and he wouldn't die, but in actuality he had passed, or if Dr. Pitts, didn't really check the pulse, or if he had maybe fibbed. We don't really know, and we'll never know that. But when Mr. Thomas did get back, he and Dr. Pitts carried Dr. Walter to Dr. Pitts's room. And this is something that wasn't mentioned in the reports immediately after the events took place. So this was pretty new to the information that I had found previously. However, Dr. Pitts then turned to Mr. Thomas and handed him 4 empty cartridges. So 4 empty cartridges for the 4 shots that were fired. This made me think, why did he pick up the cartridges? I mean, admittedly, I've never shot a gun. Plus, these are very, very much older models than anything today. So I'm not sure how the cartridges may have fallen or if they were in a chamber. But the fact that he actually had them, that they seemed to be in the forefront of his mind, that he actually had them ready to give to someone, and in this case, it was Mr. Thomas, probably the first person that he came across other than Widow Thomas. The next person to testify was a Mr. John M. Parks, and he lived pretty close to Widow Thomas. It was only about 150 feet from where Dr. Walter died, where Mr. Parks lived. So he had a pretty close vantage point to the scene. He said that he had heard 2 shots and a scream. What adds a lot of humanity to this story, at least for me, is that Mr. Parks said that he saw Dr. Walter actually trying to get through a window. So whether he was trying to get to the closest exit, no matter what it was, or if he was confused or dazed because he was in so much pain, we won't really know. But to see a man has been injured because he heard the shots, trying desperately to get away from them, just had to be, kind of tugging at the heart. And especially knowing that he did not make it, that yes, he had died. And it was someone that Mr. Parks undoubtedly knew, with it being such a small community. But eventually he did manage to find the door. And when Mr. Parks spoke to Dr. Pitts told him that during a fight, Dr. Walter had struck him, meaning Pitts, and so Pitts had shot him. Next to testify, and we're on the same day, was a man named Reverend Baker, and he does play a little bit more of a role in this story, but he testified on that day mainly about the layout of the home. He had been asked to draw a diagram of Widow Thomas's home, So he was there to really answer questions about the layout, the diagram that he had made, and he had made that on behalf of the Commonwealth Attorney, a Mr. Kellum. The last person to give testimony that day was a John T. Like Thomas Parks. So, yeah, we have a John M. like Michael Parks and a John T. like Thomas Parks. Now, he had met Dr. Pitts coming from the scene of the killing, and Parks could tell that something was obviously wrong, so he asked Dr. Pitts what was wrong, and Pitts replied, quote, "I have shot Walter, shot 4 bullets in him, and he is lying dead. Go there and wash the blood off his face before his wife sees him," end quote. So there might have been a couple of discrepancies, but so far things are pretty much holding to the story that was initially told. Another thing I did see here that kind of made me think a little bit was that the first Mr. Parks said he only heard 2 shots, whereas with all of the other testimony so far, it's been 4 shots, and even the 4 casings or cartridges, those match with 4. So I don't know, maybe if it was the shock of what he was seeing that he just kind of drowned them out, or the second 2 shots were kind of in the background for him as he was trying to go over and see what was going on. Now, the second day of the trial, September 11th, commenced with Reverend Baker being called back to the stand, and this time he was cross-examined. Now, the Reverend must have explored the house right after the crime, as his testimony indicated that he had noticed that a diploma was hanging on a wall, but there was a bullet hole near the bottom of the diploma. However, he did make a distinction that he said it looked like a bullet hole. What the defense was counting on, though, was to throw some doubt into whether or not Reverend Baker could be partial. Earlier, I mentioned the letter that the friends of Dr. Pitts had written and taken to the Baltimore Sun. Reverend Baker wrote kind of a response to that, but it wasn't put into the Baltimore Sun. It was put into a newspaper called the Virginian. The defense wanted to know if in any way Reverend Baker had felt coerced or maybe directed to write that response, trying to bring some doubt into whether or not his retelling of events was entirely accurate. So the defense kind of wanted to just give that little bit of doubt as to whether or not Baker could have remained objective about the whole situation. He did, emphasize that he had only told the truth, emphasizing that he was not forced in any way to make that response to the newspaper. Reverend Baker also did disclose that he had a conversation on the day of the killing with Pitts, and that Dr. Pitts had said that he would have rather had been the one who had died, that he would rather be in Dr. Walter's place, because now he was worried about getting into heaven. Pitts also indicated to Reverend Baker that there had been some type of animosity previously, but it was not specifically stated as to what this was. And based on what Mrs. Walter, so Dr. Walter's widow, had said in some reports initially, she didn't think that there really was anything at that time where they may have not been friendly or cordial to each other, because she used the word cordial in one place. So if it was something that was there, either Mrs. Walter didn't want to say it, or in the heat of everything that was going on, it may have been something that had taken place a while back, or something that she didn't think was relevant and just forgot at that point. But according to the Reverend, Dr. Pitts had told him, quote, "It was an old trouble between myself and Walter," end quote. According to Pitts, the 2 men had met the previous day of the killing, but then also emphasized to the Reverend that he had killed Walter in self-defense. There is a slight difference here from some of the other retellings of the story in what supposedly Pitt had said. Reverend Baker said that Pitts had told him that Walter had knocked him down. The exact wording is different throughout. Just to give you kind of a spoiler, in this particular instance, yes, there are some discrepancies. Testimony written in the Peninsula Enterprise on September 20th of 1884 said, quote, Walter had knocked him down, didn't know whether he struck him again or not, but he, this is in reference to Pitts, fell across the bed, and as he rose, he shot Walter 3 or 4 times. It was done in self-defense, end quote. So just remember the part about falling across the bed. Next to testify was a man who had known Dr. Walter for basically his whole life. This was Captain W.H. Jacobs, and he had actually seen Dr. Walter not too long before the killing, and he said that he could see that Dr. Walter was still getting over his illness and still seemed to be pretty weak, saying that he only weighed about 140 or 150 pounds. This testimony was given to kind of emphasize that Walter was not really in a position to start a fight with someone. Now, something that differs from what other reports say was the position of Widow Thomas, who was the owner of the boarding home. However, when she testified that she was in the kitchen and heard what she described as a fuss. Now, as there were no diagrams or descriptions of the grounds surrounding Widow Thomas's home, I do know that a lot of times kitchens would be separate from the home. So it's entirely possible that she had been outside in the garden, as she had stated, and at some point had made her way to the kitchen. And upon hearing the shots, came out of the kitchen when she heard the fuss. She was in time to see Dr. Walter stumbling out the door and trying to hold his wounds. And again, Widow Thomas states that she only heard 2 shots. So here's 2 pieces of testimony that say it was only 2 shots, even though we know it was 4. Now, the other Miss Thomas, the one who had been ill, that Dr. Walter was seeing that day, now she was pretty close to where all of this took place as well. Actually in a room next to Dr. Pitts. She said that she could hear the men talking, but couldn't make out specifically what was being said. And here again, it's mentioned that 2 pistol shots were fired. Next up was an Eliza Crockett. She didn't really add too much to what was already being stated, other than saying that Dr. Walter had confessed to her afterwards, saying that he had asked her to take him to Onancock, which is another city in Virginia, so that he could turn himself in. Now, this is just a side note for myself. If someone had come up to me and told me that they had just killed someone, I think I would have a rather hard time feeling comfortable about taking them anywhere. Now, remembering, too, that it wouldn't have been just a 10-minute drive to get him there, and even today, to get off Tangier Island, it would take more than that. But I don't really think that I would want to have that person with me for an extended period of time, especially if I was going to be alone. Now, she was the last witness for the morning session, and in the afternoon, both of the doctors who had examined Dr. Walter's body testified to the 4 shots. So they are saying definitely 4 shots. And 2 out of the 4 would have been fatal. Now, if it wasn't for the fact that Pitts provided or gave to Mr. Thomas 4 cartridges or casings, I probably would have been questioning everything about the number of shots. Just because of all of the discrepancies. I would even have been trying to think of a magic bullet theory, about how 1 bullet could have caused, 3 different wounds because just everybody was saying 2 shots were fired. But the doctors who examined him were saying that it was 4 shots. This is just something that kind of lingers with me, and If it was just one person who said 2 shots, it wouldn't faze me, but it's multiple people at this point. Now, there were some other pieces of testimony that don't really add anything to the story, but just kind of reinforces what's already been said. So I'm not going to go into every person who testified, just if there's new or key evidence given. There was a witness whose name was L.V. Parks, yes, another Parks, who said that he saw Dr. Pitts near Dr. Walter's home on the night prior to the shooting. And it was apparently pretty late at night, so that did seem kind of suspicious to some. And in yet another man with the last name of Parks, Willie in this case, said that Dr. Pitts had tried to trade firearms with him. And again, these are very consistent. I just think it's important to show that reinforcement of trying to exchange guns. And the last testimony of that day was a witness who said that 3 weeks prior to the killing, that he had a conversation with Dr. Pitts where Dr. Pitts said that, quote, Dr. Walter would not have his practice for long, end quote, with yet another saying that Dr. Pitts directly said that he was going to kill Dr. Walter when he saw him again. Day 3 of the trial seemed a little lengthy based on the testimony, and there's some pretty good detail on that day. A man named John Fox was testifying on behalf of the defense. He'd known both of the men and had actually seen them the night before the killing at approximately 5 p.m. He had heard a conversation, and it gives us a better idea of what the discussion of a fee schedule meant, and specifically giving us that turning point where they realized they needed to meet. According to Mr. Fox, Dr. Walter had approached Dr. Pitts and said that he had wanted to see him. Pitts then replied that he had also wanted to talk to Dr. Walter. Pitts had been under the impression that Dr. Walter was purposely undercharging people as a way to increase his practice. So one example that was given was that when Dr. Pitts said that, in speaking with Mrs. Thomas, not clear which Thomas this was, that Dr. Walter had said that it would only be 50 cents a visit. Now, the type of accounting that Dr. Walter supposedly gave seemed more than a little creative, but it did seem like Dr. Walter was trying to help his patient out. This patient did have an ongoing illness, so she had actually built up quite a large balance with Dr. Walter. It would almost seem like some of her balance was forgiven. And we see that today too with some of the assistance plans, financial assistance that some hospitals provide. It sounded like Dr. Walter was trying to do the same for a patient who had a lot of medical bills, and he would still be getting paid some, maybe not the full amount, but he wanted, to try to help out his patient as much as he could. But this did make the men realize that they should meet probably and set forth an actual schedule so that they could still be competitive, at least in the area of pricing. They didn't set a specific time to go over the fees, though, with Dr. Walter just saying that, and while this could have been a tense situation, Mr. Fox said that actually the men were still cordial to each other, so it didn't seem like there was any anger, at least to him, in the conversation that he had heard. On the actual day of the murder, Mr. Fox had been walking in the direction towards the boarding house where Dr. Walter had been shot and Dr. Pitts lived. He encountered Dr. Pitts, who told him, or rather asked him, to come back to the boarding house with him as Dr. Walter was dead. Like with the conversation with Reverend Baker, Pitts did reflect that he was scared of the consequences, but unlike with Reverend Baker, he didn't clarify whether he meant the consequences on Earth or in the afterlife. But hearing that Dr. Walter was dead, Mr. Fox did go back to the boarding home with Dr. Pitts, where Dr. Pitts told a version of the story that both men had been in Pitts's room discussing the fee schedule. But once again, the topic of Ms. Thomas came up about charging, how much Dr. Walter would be charging, that type of thing, and that kind of raised up the animosity a little bit. To put it in a short version, Pitts thought Dr. Walter was poaching patients, kind of disregarding the fact that Walter was Ms. Thomas's doctor before Pitts ever was. So I guess that was a point that Pitts may not have thought of. According to Pitts, during this discussion, Dr. Walter became very upset with Dr. Pitts. Dr. Walter had called Pitts a damned liar, and Walter supposedly knocked him out of the chair that he had been sitting in. After he had been on the floor after being knocked off the chair, Walter supposedly grabbed him, kicked, and hit him time after time. It was at this point that Pitts supposedly shot Dr. Walter. To bring up points from previous descriptions or tellings of the story, Dr. Pitts said that he fell across the bed, and it was at that point he shot. We just heard in this testimony that they said Dr. Pitts told him that he had fallen onto the floor. Plus, in any previous version, we haven't heard it said that Dr. Walter supposedly kept hitting Dr. Pitts. Mr. Fox, though, did say that he saw that there was a lump under Dr. Pitts's eye, and since he had just seen him the night before, he could testify that it had not been there at that time. So it would have been an injury that was received sometime between the night before the killing and the killing itself. To end the morning session, another witness testified that Dr. Pitts had told him that he had been struck and kicked, and this witness also saw the lump or injury under the eye. The afternoon of the third day of testimony, with the defense continuing its case, brought some doctors to the stand who knew Dr. Pitts professionally, knew him as a patient, or both. Dr. Frank West had treated Pitts for his morphine addiction in Baltimore, but he had also described Pitts as being very popular as a student, so he did know Dr. Pitts in both manners, as a doctor and as a patient. West testified that a man named Severn Parks, so yes, another Parks, and also I had to do a double take because there is a town on the other side of the bridge, or the western shore, named Severna Park. So when I saw Severn Parks, I kind of had to do a double take, but we have another Parks. He testified that he heard Reverend Baker say, quote, he believed Pitts guilty of murder and would do anything he could to break his neck, end quote. Breaking his neck would have been a reference to hanging. I want to make sure, though, that the chain of testimony here is clear. Dr. Frank West did not say that he heard Reverend Baker say this. He said that he heard another person say that Dr. Baker said it, or Reverend Baker. Sorry, there are a lot of titles and names in here. But I do wonder if that testimony would have been allowed today, as to me it seems like hearsay. In some testimony earlier on, a witness had said that Dr. Pitts said that he only shot at Walter until he left him alone, meaning he only shot Walter until he felt it was necessary. So that raised some questions in the testimony from two different doctors, and the testimony conflicted. One doctor, after reviewing the wounds that Dr. Walter had received, said that there was no way that he could have tried to hit Dr. Pitts after sustaining the initial injuries, especially the one near the heart. But another doctor said that if he had been able to stagger out to the door, it's possible that he could have still hit someone. Yet a third doctor testified in this case, or on that day, but it was Dr. Pitts's brother, so really, the only thing that I can see that's kind of objective is him saying that, yes, he saw the lump under his brother's eye. Now, Reverend Baker, once again, was called back to the stand. The Commonwealth attorney, or what we would call a prosecutor, Mr. Neely, read article or letter written by Reverend Baker, and what the whole fuss about was with that came down to the expression that supposedly Reverend Baker said, saying he would do everything he could to break Dr. Pitts's neck by hanging. But even though the defense was trying to show that Reverend Baker may have been biased against Dr. Pitts, according to the Reverend, what he had actually said was that he would do whatever he could do, quote, truthfully and rightly he would do to break his neck, end quote. So Reverend Baker added in the truthfully and rightly, meaning that if testimony and evidence came forward that surely showed that Dr. Pitts was in fact the killer and it was murder, then he would do everything that it took to see him hang. To condense the whole thing about the back and forth on that down to a much shorter bit of testimony. A man testified next for the defense by the name of Smith Walter. I'm just going to call him Smith so that we don't get him confused with Dr. Walter. But Smith said that he heard Mr. Fox, who was a previous witness, say to someone else, so not even talking directly to Smith, that it was Dr. Pitts that struck Dr. Walter first, but Dr. Pitts did get knocked down by Walter after that, but only fell on his left arm and knee, then claiming that's when he shot Dr. Walter, that he shot him basically from the floor. There continued to be other testimony, but it didn't conflict or bring anything new to the trial, so I'm going to skip over all of that and just get to the verdict. He was found guilty, which was not a surprise to many people, especially as Dr. Pitts admitted readily that he had shot Dr. Walter, and Pitts was sentenced to 18 years in jail. Some may have thought this was a little light, and it could have been because a lot of people did feel that the drug use had affected Dr. Pitts's thinking. One doctor called it a disordered mind. So, some people did give kind of thoughts to that as to whether or not he should get a longer sentence or even be executed. So, you may think this is where things end. But no, that would be way too easy, especially as I'm approaching an hour here, or might even be past it, depending on how much I need to edit throughout the episode. But the judge who presided over the trial, a Judge Booker, had to go to a hospital and receive surgery in Baltimore the following month for surgery on his eye. He had been injured somehow, and while specifics weren't given, it sounds like one eye got severely infected, and he actually had to have that eye removed. They needed to do that because the infection could have spread to the other eye, and he would have either passed away from the infection or could have lost both eyes. So they had to go ahead with that surgery. However, he was not down for long. Remember, the trial took place in September, so Booker would have had his surgery in October, but he was back in November, just 1 month after his surgery, and he was back in court to overrule the motion from the defense for a new trial. But as we will see here, there were still immediate appeals filed. Pitts's defense asked for a suspended sentence until they could actually finish the appeal. This showed that the defense attorneys did intend to go beyond the district court to the state Supreme Court or even higher to have the appeal heard. And take it further they did to circuit court, where a Judge Henley granted the new trial. The original verdict was overturned because one witness had testified that he had seen Dr. James Pitts with a pistol in his office, saying that he was going to kill Dr. Walter, even adding that he would kill 2 more within a, quote, short time, end quote. So this was deemed to be inadmissible, but I do find it, just odd to me that someone said that they specifically saw and heard this, whereas in other cases, such as Dr. West, he indicated that it was someone else who told him information, yet he was still able to testify, even though he wasn't the one who heard it himself. But he was a defense witness, and since the prosecution had won, they wouldn't really appeal anything. So to me, the defense kind of lucked out there. Of course, I don't know what all the laws were back then, but for this piece of testimony to be thrown out and a new trial granted when someone said Dr. Pitts was in their office, so testifying firsthand, that it was overruled because of that, yet other testimony was given where it was, said to a third party completely, and we didn't hear testimony from that third party. So the new trial was set for May of 1885, and Judge Booker was going to preside. However, there were, I'm just going to say, a ton of delays, and many of them were health-related, including for Judge Booker himself. It was not clear if the illness was related to his eye or not, but at that point, it was decided to transfer the case to Norfolk County, so to a different county entirely now. So it would be a completely new venue for them. But another conflict arose when Pitts's attorney and then someone else became ill, postponing the trial yet again. And what was happening here is for every day that they were having testimony, they would have to bring the witnesses over or have them stay somewhere. Because of the difficulty of travel, they would all have to be put up for the evening, at least for one night. So it was going to cost about $11 a day, which was worth a lot more at that time. So they had to house and feed people, provide for transportation. And after much back and forth about some of these issues, the trial was still being postponed again and again, as finally the new trial date seemed to be confirmed and was going to be starting in September of 1885. There were issues that arose with some of the witnesses from Tangier Island. They were very ill and would need special transportation. It may be even to the point that they couldn't travel at all. This led to another postponement to see if they could get a man named Captain George Thomas to the city to testify. With the trial being postponed so many times and the attorneys needing to again and again adjust their schedules, as they'd anticipated on having this trial completed long before September of 1885, the courts allowed the testimony given by Captain Thomas in the original trial to be admitted into evidence. They were still going to see if there was any possible way he could be moved, but in order to at least get the trial going, they would make that concession if it did come to the point where Mr. Thomas could not be moved. In one last attempt by the defense to try to get the case thrown out completely, is they were trying to argue that the accused did not receive a speedy trial. But he did originally receive the speedy trial. It was just that the original verdict was overruled. The trial was very speedy from the original indictment to the original trial. So this request by the defense was overruled. Now, there were still 26 witnesses for the defense. The prosecution only had 6. At the beginning of the second trial, a journalist wrote regarding Dr. Pitts and his appearance, saying that, quote, his contracted and repugnant quarters appear not to have suffered in the least by his confinement, end quote. So kind of dissecting that, I think he's saying that Dr. Pitts was where he belonged, that Dr. Pitts wasn't bothered at all, even though he was amongst, very dreary and drab conditions. It was also shortly thereafter determined that Mr. Thomas was not going to be able to make it to testify. And as was symbolic with this case, an article that appeared in the Norfolk Landmark on September 23rd, 1885, had the title of Dr. Pitts - Nothing Done. This was because Dr. Pitts's attorney was not feeling well, so he went home. And I do want to clarify a little earlier, I just realized this. I think I may have referred to Mr. Neely as the Commonwealth attorney or prosecutor, but he was actually one of Dr. Pitts's attorney. We do have information about Mrs. Walter in this trial, as she did give testimony. And this may have led to some clarity on the motive. She testified that when they did first return to Tangier Island after Dr. Walter had been ill, and Dr. Pitts also had been at the hospital, she said that the two men saw each other and shook hands, but then Dr. Pitts said, quote, "Why, I thought you were not coming back here," end quote. She said that her husband's response was that he didn't see what that had to do with Dr. Pitts. To me, one of the most dramatic exchanges of the second trial came on the fourth day, so we actually got to 4 days on this one, where once again Reverend Baker was questioned about that statement he made and breaking the neck. Mr. Neely, Pitt's attorney, asked him, quote, "Did you not say on the island you would do anything to break the prisoner's neck," end quote. Reverend Baker emphasized that what he said was that he would do it fairly and justly, or justly and truthfully. So in other words, Reverend Baker was trying to say that if the jury found him guilty using truthful and factual fair evidence, then yes, he would do whatever he could to promote for the death penalty. So it sounds like this was expanded more upon in the second trial than in the original one, as it sounded like the exchange was a little more intense than originally in the first trial. Baker also said that one of the ways that he could promote just and truthful evidence was by providing testimony himself. During the testimony, Mr. Neely asked Baker, quote, "You are a preacher, are you not?" quote, with Baker replying, "Yes, sir." Neely said, "Is it your vocation to urge the saving of souls or to break necks?" When I read that, I actually said, ooh, I'm kind of surprised that it was, well, I could just kind of see it in my mind, and how you may have a version in your head of what a courtroom might have looked like back then. And I can see these men who look like they're some of the most esteemed gentlemen, but even just the hint of an aspersions to someone's name at that time was a very serious issue. And so to have an attorney pretty much grilling a reverend about what he meant and asking if it's his job to break necks, that had to be probably pretty shocking for that time period. Reverend Baker countered that, quote, "It is my vocation to urge the saving of souls, and in the cause of justice to break necks also," end quote. We hear a little bit about the article or letter that Dr. Baker wrote, and just to paraphrase some here, he called Pitts a miscreant and murderer, which, he did admit to killing Walter, so, murderer wasn't too far of a stretch, even though he was saying self-defense. But I'm pretty sure miscreant would have brought forth a whole torrent of emotions because, as seen in a previous case and then earlier in this one, damned liar is considered a very serious slur against someone. Neely did continue, though, with some good points about how if Baker had felt this way, and the article did reflect that he seemed to be more pro-Walter, in other words, that Dr. Walter was not the first to strike or hit someone. Neely was trying to show that Baker was not impartial, so when he showed the diagram of the house and gave that very first testimony on the very first day of the first trial, that he could not have been objective when giving that testimony. Also, could he be counted on to be objective during this testimony? And that's what Mr. Neely was trying to get across. Dr. West once again testified as to Dr. Pitts's condition when hospitalized in Baltimore. While he was for the defense, I do at points find some of his testimony leaning more towards the prosecution, at least, probably according to their understanding at the time. Now we have a better idea and understanding about addiction, and we have much better treatments than they could have ever dreamed of back then. Since we have that better understanding, there are rehabilitation services and counselors that can try to work with patients, and they specialize in just those areas. West called Pitts a perfect wreck when he first arrived at the hospital in Baltimore, and he said this was both mentally and physically. Pitts had stayed there 2 weeks, and Dr. West wanted him to stay actually longer, another month. He didn't think that 2 weeks was enough time for a man to go back to a medical practice, with all the stress and everything that comes along with being a doctor, but Pitts was insistent and he left. It wasn't too much longer after this that Walter returned, and then the killing of Dr. Walter took place. Now, the reason why I said this could have lent more towards the prosecution was that meant he would have willingly gone against the advice of a trusted colleague, maybe even mentor, and purposely decided to go back to the island, foregoing any more treatment. So again, given the understanding of addiction at that time, I don't know exactly how the jury would have interpreted that. There probably today would have been more expert witnesses to testify on the effects of addiction, or counselors who may have spoken with Dr. Pitts quite often, whereas here we have a man who, though a doctor, doesn't necessarily have that specialty, and overall, medicine didn't really have that understanding. So I think the jury may get the wrong impression or not completely understand things, even to the understanding of that day. I'm hoping I'm explaining all of that right, as it's all kind of rolling around in my head. But if I had heard that, especially, with what my knowledge of history is, I can see some people on the jury, kind of thinking that Pitts made the deliberate decision to leave the hospital, so anything that happened after that would fall on his shoulders. This was really the end of, any major testimony. Most other witnesses just testified about the mark or lump underneath of Pitts's eye. So on September 28th, 1885, the jury once again found Dr. Pitts guilty of murder. And I want to ask everybody just to think for a minute and wonder what his sentence was for murder. Not manslaughter, not assault and battery, nothing like that. No, this was a conviction of murder, yet he got 5 years in prison. His original sentence was 18 years. This was 5. And I have to wonder, though, from the judge's viewpoint, if the testimony about his addiction and about him leaving the hospital early may have had a different impact on sentencing, because, even though he left the hospital intentionally, he still was a man who, according to previous reports, had a, quote, disordered mind, end quote. So this is really the only mitigating circumstance that I can find to bring an 18-year sentence down to 5, especially when the charge was murder. And I went back through because I thought it had to be a charge for manslaughter somewhere, like a secondary charge. But no, it was murder, and he got 5 years. So, a lot of people, I'm sure, question the leniency of the sentence. Well, if you thought that 5 years was light for murder, Pitts never got the chance to serve those 5 years. Just some of them. The reason why was that the governor of Virginia, A. Governor Lee, pardoned Dr. James Pitts in January of 1888. So, looking at the time frame here, it was less than 4 years from the time of the murder to him being pardoned. So that means he didn't serve anywhere near, in my opinion, enough time. Unsurprisingly, he decided to relocate to another part of the country, most likely somewhere in the West, to set up practice again. But his freedom was short-lived, as I did find an article in the May 24th, 1890 edition of the Peninsula Enterprise, where there was a brief note that said, quote, "Information has been received here that Dr. James Dennis Pitts, who was tried in Norfolk County a few years ago for the killing of Dr. Walter on Tangier Island and was sentenced to the penitentiary and pardoned, died in Reynolds, Nebraska on the 15th, end quote. It is important to be careful here too, as I came across so many James Pitts through my research. I would find blurbs about one passing away, some committing different crimes, even 2 other James Pitts that had committed murder around the same time. But this one did specifically mention Dr. Walter, so this is the one I'm 100% confident in was the right person. So I'd be interested in hearing what you may think about this case. If you thought there might have been, in regards to the sentencing and the pardon, any favoritism because of who his family was, if you thought 5 years was a fair sentence or not, given mitigating circumstances about how drug use may have affected his mind. Do you agree with some testimony that seemed like hearsay being allowed to stand, yet someone saying they directly heard something and had a conversation with them about trading a gun was the reason that the first verdict was overturned? And I want to thank everybody for sticking in with this monster of an episode, or I guess you'd say 3 episodes total, which I would have never thought I found out that much information about one family or even just 2 sets of brothers, and the events that they were involved in took place in the 1800s. But thankfully there was, material from the time period. It may not have covered everything, but there was a lot of good information, I think, in those articles, and really makes me really question why he only got the 5 years. The one thing I did kind of want to mention was the discrepancy with the 2 shots and 4 shots. I wonder if it was also something that really wouldn't have been considered as much then as it would be now, but maybe the shock of hearing, the 2 gunshots. Did they kind of tune out the other ones, trying to find out where they were coming from or trying to hide? For those that looked out the window, such as the one witness who saw Dr. Walter try to get out of a window, that after seeing that, was he kind of in a state of shock? And we know that Pitts shot Dr. Walter even as he was walking out the door. Could that person who only heard those 2 shots, just kind of block them out after seeing one man shoot another? I don't know. That's just a theory of mine. But it is kind of unusual that at least 3 witnesses said only 2 shots. And truthfully, I think I'm just going to end it here because I would probably keep bringing up points over the next, half an hour at least. But those are just more kind of my thoughts. If you have any thoughts you'd like to share, please go to YouTube or YouTube Music. That is a positive, at least, as compared to Google Podcasts. You couldn't leave messages or comments, I should say, but on YouTube Music you can. I hope everybody has a great week, and I will talk to you again soon. Bye.